I need to say this clearly before I begin. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I have never been one. I hold a PhD in Near Eastern archaeology from the University of Chicago. I spent 11 years directing or co-directing excavation projects across Turkey, Jordan, and northern Iraq. I have published in peer-reviewed journals. I have given talks at conferences where the audience wore lanyards and drank bad coffee and argued about stratigraphic methodology until midnight. I say all of this not to impress anyone, but because what I am about to describe requires you to understand that I came to it as a trained skeptic. As someone whose professional life was built on the slow, boring accumulation of evidence, and that what I found beneath the hill in southeastern Turkey broke that training in ways I am still trying to articulate. My name is Thomas Calder. I was 43 years old in the spring of 2023 when I entered the site we had designated KT9, a previously unexcavated satellite mound 11 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe in Şanlıurfa province. I entered it as an archaeologist leading a routine survey of anomalous ground-penetrating radar returns. I exited it 9 days later as something else entirely. Quick question before we continue. Where are you watching from right now? And tell me, do you watch these late at night or while doing something else? If you have a story idea or want me to turn your name into a survival story, comment it below. Now, let's dive back in. What I found inside did not confirm any existing theory. It did not align with any published literature. It did not make sense within any framework I had been trained in. What I found was proof, and I need you to understand what that proof means before it happens again. The project had started normally enough. I was attached to a joint Turkish-American survey initiative mapping subsurface anomalies within a 30-kilometer radius of Göbekli Tepe, the famous Neolithic site whose carved T-pillars had already rewritten assumptions about early human civilization. The Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism had granted limited excavation permits for 3 secondary mounds where GPR scans had returned unusual signatures, voids too regular to be geological, too deep to be standard burial chambers. KT7 and KT8 had turned up interesting but ultimately conventional material. Mud brick walls, fire-cracked stone, fragments of plaster bearing faint pigment traces. Nothing that justified the anomalous radar depth. KT9 was different. The mound itself was unremarkable. A low hump of wind-blown soil and limestone scree on a gentle slope overlooking a seasonal creek, surrounded by pistachio orchards. A farmer named Mehmet, whose family had worked the land for generations, told us through our translator that his grandfather had once tried to plant olive trees on the mound and gave up because the soil was too shallow before hitting rock. His grandfather had also told him the hill was unlucky. Mehmet said this without embarrassment, the way you might mention that a particular road floods in spring, a fact of the landscape. The GPR returns from KT9 showed a void beginning approximately 4 meters below surface grade and extending downward at least 12 meters, far deeper than anything we had encountered at the other sites. The void was roughly circular in plan, perhaps 15 meters in diameter, and appeared to contain internal subdivisions, walls, chambers, possible corridors. The signature was clean. Whatever was down there was built, not natural. We opened a 2-meter square test trench on the mound's south face, where the radar suggested the void came closest to the surface. For the first 3 meters, we cut through typical Neolithic fill, compacted soil, scattered animal bone, flint debitage, a single obsidian blade fragment that would later be sourced to the Nemrut Dağ flows. Standard material for the region and period. At 3.4 meters, we hit worked stone. Not mud brick, not plaster. Limestone blocks dressed and fitted with a precision that had no business being at that depth in that context. The joints were tight, tighter than Göbekli Tepe's own construction. Whoever built this had not merely stacked stones. They had engineered a sealed surface. We spent 2 days carefully exposing a roughly 1.5-meter section of this stone face before we found the seam. A vertical joint, slightly wider than the others, running from the base of our excavation downward. Behind it, the GPR void. I remember the moment we pulled the first block free. I was standing in the trench with Elif Arslan, our Turkish co-director, and James Okoro, our physical anthropologist from the University of Lagos. The block came out cleanly. Too cleanly, as if it had been designed for removal. Behind it was darkness and a breath of air that was not stale. It was cold. It smelled like wet calcium and something else I could not place. Something faintly organic, but not like decomposition. More like dried mushroom. Like spore. Elif said something in Turkish that I did not catch. James took a step back. I leaned in with a headlamp and looked through the opening into a corridor that extended beyond the reach of the light. The walls were dressed stone. The floor was flat. And on the wall directly opposite the opening, at eye level, someone had carved a figure. I need to describe this carving precisely because everything that followed depended on it. The figure was roughly 30 centimeters tall, incised into the limestone with a tool that left U-shaped channels, not the flat-bottomed grooves typical of Neolithic carving in the region. It depicted a human form, upright, arms extended forward. The head was disproportionately tilted, as if the neck were broken or the skull were hanging at an angle inconsistent with voluntary posture. The mouth was open. Not in a scream, but in the way a jaw hangs open when the muscles controlling it are no longer functioning. And the eyes were represented not as the standard Neolithic circle and dot motif, but as empty recesses. Blanks. Not carved at all. As if the artist had deliberately left the space where eyes should be as raw, unworked stone. Below the figure, a second figure was carved in the same style. This one was on the ground, horizontal. And the standing figure was positioned directly above it, the open mouth aligned with the prone figure's torso. I photographed it. I measured it. I noted the tool marks, the patina, the mineral deposits that had accumulated in the carved channels over what I estimated, based on comparable surface weathering in the region, to be at minimum 8,000 years. I told myself it was a hunting scene, a ritual depiction, an allegory. We widened the opening over the following day, removing 4 more blocks to create an aperture large enough to enter. I submitted a preliminary report to the ministry and to our institutional partners. I described the find as a previously unknown subterranean structure of probable pre-pottery Neolithic date, possibly ceremonial. I requested expanded excavation permits and additional personnel. Then, without waiting for the permits, and I acknowledge this was a professional lapse I have no adequate defense for, I went inside. My justification at the time was structural assessment. The corridor appeared stable, but I wanted to confirm there was no collapse risk before we brought in the broader team. I told Elif I would go no more than 20 meters in. I took a headlamp, a backup flashlight, a handheld radio, a water bottle, a small field notebook, and a mechanical pencil. The corridor ran straight for approximately 8 meters, then turned 90 degrees to the left and descended via a series of broad, shallow steps, each one cut from a single piece of limestone, fitted with the same unsettling precision. The air remained cool and carried that same faint organic scent. My headlamp beam showed dressed stone walls, a flat ceiling roughly 2 meters high, and periodic carvings on both walls at irregular intervals. I stopped at each carving. I photographed each one. I will describe them in the order I encountered them. The second carving was a group of figures, 11 by my count, standing in a rough semicircle, all upright, all with the same broken neck head tilt, the same hanging jaw. In the center of the semicircle, a single figure faced them. This central figure was distinguished by lines radiating from its hands, not weapons, not tools. The lines extended outward and connected to the bodies of the surrounding figures, as if the central figure were controlling them, or examining them, or connected to them by something flowing between. The third carving was larger and more complex. It depicted what I can only describe as a settlement, small rectangular structures arranged around a central open space, the standard layout of a pre-pottery Neolithic village. But the village was divided by a heavy carved line. On one side, figures stood normally, vertical, proportional, engaged in recognizable activities, carrying objects, standing near animals, kneeling at what might be hearths. On the other side of the line, the figures had the tilt, the jaw, the blanks where eyes should be, and they were pressed against the dividing line as if trying to cross it. I stood in front of that carving for a long time. My radio crackled with Elif's voice asking for a status check. I told her I was fine. I told her the structure was stable. I did not tell her what I was looking at because I did not yet have language for it. The steps continued downward. I counted 47 of them before the corridor leveled into a wider chamber, roughly 6 meters across, roughly circular, with 4 openings leading off in different directions. The ceiling was higher here, perhaps 3 meters, and it was covered in carvings. I tilted my head back and let the headlamp sweep across them. They told a story. Read in sequence, and I was not certain of the sequence, but the spatial logic suggested a clockwise progression starting from the corridor I had entered through. They told a story that I will render here as plainly as I can. First panel, a village, normal life. Figures engaged in agriculture, animal husbandry, construction. A river or stream running nearby. Stars indicated above, possibly seasonal markers. Second panel. An animal, I could not identify the species, perhaps a boar or a large canid, lying on its side. Figures surrounding it. One figure with a hand extended toward the animal's mouth. Below the animal, small marks that I initially interpreted as vegetation, but later reconsidered as something emerging from the animal's body. Spreading. Third panel. A single human figure lying horizontal. Around the prone figure, 3 standing figures. One of the standing figures had the tilt, the broken neck, the hanging jaw, the blank eyes. The other 2 standing figures were leaning away from the tilted one, retreating. Fourth panel. Multiple tilted figures, many of them, moving in a mass toward the dividing line from the earlier corridor carving. On the other side of the line, normal figures building, stacking blocks, raising walls, constructing something. Fifth panel. The constructed something was recognizable. It was the structure I was standing inside. The corridor. The descending steps. The central chamber. Rendered in cross-section, carved into limestone 8,000 years ago, matching the architecture around me with a fidelity that made my hands shake. Sixth panel. Figures inside the structure. Normal figures. And above the structure, on the surface, a swarm of tilted figures. The blank-eyed, broken-necked, jaw-hanging figures covered the surface in such density that the carver had abandoned individual depiction and simply filled the space with overlapping bodies. Seventh panel. The surface was empty. No tilted figures. No normal figures. Nothing. The village was gone. The animals were gone. Only the structure remained, sealed beneath the earth. Eighth panel. Plants. Small marks. Vegetation. Growing from the empty surface. And emerging from the ground, through the plants, a single human figure. Normal. Upright. Eyes carved with the standard circle and dot motif. Alive. I sat down on the stone floor of that chamber, and I turned off my headlamp, and I sat in darkness that no human being had occupied in 8 millennia. And I breathed, and I tried to find a professional framework that could contain what I was looking at. I could not find one. What the ceiling panels depicted, in a visual grammar consistent with pre-pottery Neolithic symbolic conventions, was a sequence I could not rationalize as ritual metaphor or seasonal allegory or mythological narrative. It was too specific. The architectural cross-section alone, its accuracy, its match to the physical space around me, disqualified abstraction. This was not symbolic. This was documentary. The panels described a pathogen. They described it entering a human population through animal contact. They described its effect, a transformation of the living into something that retained mobility but lost volition, that moved in groups, that attacked the uninfected. They described the construction of this underground shelter as a direct response. They described a siege. They described the surface being overrun. They described the surface eventually clearing. And they described emergence. They described, in images carved before the invention of writing, the same event that every zombie narrative in modern fiction pretends to imagine for the first time. I turned my headlamp back on. I stood up, and instead of going back the way I came, I chose one of the 4 branching corridors. This was not rational. I knew it was not rational. But the professional part of my mind, the part that had spent 11 years training itself to follow evidence wherever it led, was no longer negotiating with the part of me that wanted to climb those 47 steps and walk out into sunlight and never come back. The corridor I chose, the one directly opposite the entry corridor, leading roughly north, sloped downward at a gentle grade for perhaps 30 meters before opening into a second chamber. This one was different. It was a living space. Stone platforms along 2 walls, roughly the size and height of beds, 6 of them. A central depression in the floor that showed fire blackening. Niches carved into the walls at regular intervals, shelf-sized, some of them still containing objects. I moved along the walls, examining each niche. The first contained a stone vessel, a small lidded container carved from a single piece of basalt, sitting upright as if someone had placed it there yesterday. I did not open it. The second contained animal bones, small ones, rodent-sized, gnawed clean, deposited in a neat pile. The third contained seeds, desiccated but identifiable by shape, emmer wheat, possibly einkorn, thousands of years old, stored. The fourth niche contained a human skull. It was sitting upright, facing outward, placed with obvious intention. The mandible was missing. The cranium showed no trauma, but the interior. I leaned close, holding my breath. The interior surface of the brain case was discolored in a pattern I had never seen in archaeological bone. A dark, branching stain that radiated from the base of the skull, from the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord enters, outward across the inner surface of the parietal and frontal bones, like the root system of a plant, like a network, like something that had grown inside the skull while the skull was still occupied. I photographed it from 4 angles. My hands were steady because I made them steady. The 5th niche contained a second skull. Same placement, same missing mandible, same branching interior discoloration. The 6th niche was empty. A thin layer of calcium deposit covered its floor. Whatever had been there was gone, or had never been placed. I went back to the central chamber, and chose another corridor.
This one ran east and was narrower, low enough that I had to duck in places.
It terminated after 15 meters in a small room, barely 3 meters square, that had been sealed. I say sealed because the doorway showed evidence of having been blocked with fitted stones at some point in the past, and those stones had been removed. Not recently. The removal was ancient, the displaced blocks sitting against the corridor wall with the same patina of age as everything else. But someone, a very long time ago, had sealed this room, and then someone else, also a very long time ago, had unsealed it. Inside, the room contained a single feature, a large flat stone, waist height, roughly the dimensions of an operating table. The surface of the stone was channeled. Grooves ran from the center to the edges, converging at one end into a deeper channel that drained into a carved basin set into the floor. The grooves and the basin were stained dark, not fire blackening, not mineral deposit.
The stain was the reddish-brown of oxidized iron,
of old blood. A tremendous amount of old blood. On the wall above the stone table, more carvings. These were smaller, more detailed than the narrative panels on the ceiling of the central chamber. They showed a figure lying on a table, this table, with a second figure standing over it, making incisions. The incisions were depicted with clinical specificity. Lines on the torso, lines on the skull. In the next image, the standing figure was extracting something from inside the prone figure's head. The extracted material was rendered as a branching shape, the same branching shape that I had seen stained on the interior of the skulls in the living quarters niches. They were performing autopsies. Whoever built this place, whoever lived in it 8,000 or more years ago, was not merely hiding from the infected. They were studying them. They were cutting them open. They were removing the pathogen, or the organism, or whatever the branching network inside the skulls represented. And they were examining it. I felt something shift in my understanding that I can only describe as a floor giving way. Not terror, not excitement. A structural collapse of assumptions so fundamental that the replacement had not yet arrived to fill the space. I was standing in a pre-literate surgical theater built by people who, according to every model of human cognitive development I had been trained in, should not have possessed the conceptual framework to do what the evidence showed they had done. And they had done it because they had no choice, because the threat had demanded it. I returned to the central chamber. 2 corridors remained. I chose the one leading west. This corridor was the longest. It descended more steeply than the others, and after perhaps 40 meters, I was estimating, because my sense of distance was becoming unreliable in the featureless stone passages. It opened into the largest space I had yet encountered. A natural cavern, partially modified. The walls were limestone karst, dissolution smoothed, but the floor had been leveled, and the ceiling supported by 4 carved pillars that were not T-shaped like Göbekli Tepe's iconic forms, but cylindrical, each one roughly a meter in diameter, covered in dense carving. The cavern was approximately 20 meters across, and it was not empty. Along the far wall, arranged in rows, were human remains. Not scattered, not buried, arranged. They were skeletal, completely desiccated, held in place by the calcium-rich mineral deposits that had slowly encased them over the millennia. But their positions were deliberate. They were seated, leaning against the wall, spaced roughly a meter apart. I counted 31 of them. Their wrists were bound. Remnants of what appeared to be braided plant fiber, calcified into rigidity, encircled the wrist bones and connected each figure to iron. No, to copper. To copper pins driven into the wall behind them. They had been restrained. Seated and restrained and left here in rows, deep underground, in a cavern modified to hold them. Their skulls told me what they were. The mandibles were intact on these, jaws closed, held shut by the same braided fiber tied around the cranium. And the interior discoloration, visible through the orbital sockets and the nasal apertures where I could angle my headlamp beam, showed the same branching dark network I had seen in the niche skulls above. Every single one of them. These were the infected, restrained, contained, and stored. Not killed, or at least not killed immediately. The bindings, the copper pins, the careful spacing, the sealed cavern. This was a holding facility. A containment ward. The people who built this structure had captured infected individuals and brought them underground, and kept them alive long enough to study them. And then, I looked more carefully at the nearest skeleton, had eventually let them die, or had killed them. There was no visible skeletal trauma. No blade marks, no fractures. They had either starved or been allowed to expire through whatever natural endpoint the infection carried. 31 of them, seated in rows, patient as stone. I stood among them for what might have been 5 minutes or might have been 30. My headlamp battery indicator showed 72%. My radio had not crackled since the central chamber. I was too deep now, too much stone between me and the surface. My water bottle was 3/4 full. These were the measurements I found myself performing, and I recognized the impulse for what it was. My mind reaching for quantifiable things, because the unquantifiable thing in front of me was too large to process while standing in its presence. I made myself look at the pillars. Each of the 4 pillars was carved floor to ceiling in the same visual grammar as the panels above. Incised figures, scenes, sequential narratives. But these were different. The ceiling panels in the central chamber had told the story of one outbreak, one village, one infection, one retreat underground, one emergence. The pillars told more than one story. I started with the pillar nearest the entrance. Reading upward from the base, the carvings depicted a settlement, different from the one above, larger, with what appeared to be irrigation channels and rectangular structures consistent with a more developed community. The infection sequence was similar. Animal contact, a single transformed figure, then multiple transformed figures, then a dividing line, then construction of underground shelter, then siege, then clearance, then emergence. But the settlement's architecture was different. The agricultural indicators were different. The seasonal markers, if that is what the star patterns represented, were different. The second pillar showed another settlement, another outbreak, another cycle. The visual vocabulary was consistent, but the depicted community was distinct. Coastal, based on the wave-like motifs along the base, with boat-shaped figures and fish. The third pillar showed a third community. Mountainous terrain, indicated by zigzag ground lines. Different animals, same infection. Same sequence, same retreat, same emergence. The fourth pillar was the one that made me sit down again. It was not finished. The carvings began at the base in the same style as the others, depicting what appeared to be a large settlement, the largest of any shown, with dense rectangular structures, multiple concentric walls, and figures too numerous to count individually. But the narrative sequence stopped roughly 2/3 of the way up the pillar. The final carved scene showed the dividing line, the barrier between infected and uninfected. But beyond it, the surface above the underground shelter was not yet depicted as overrun or as cleared. The sequence simply ended. The upper third of the pillar was blank limestone, dressed smooth and prepared for carving, but never inscribed. Whoever was recording this history, this cyclical, repeating history of infection, collapse, retreat, and re-emergence, had stopped. The record was interrupted. The final cycle was incomplete. I sat on the leveled stone floor of that cavern,
among 31 restrained skeletons, and I understood three things simultaneously. First, the infection I was looking at evidence of was not a single historical event. It was a recurring phenomenon. It had happened to multiple communities in multiple environments across what the varying architectural and agricultural indicators suggested was a span of centuries or millennia. It came, it consumed, it receded, and civilization rebuilt until it came again. Second, the people who built this structure knew this. They were not merely surviving an outbreak. They were documenting a pattern. They had gathered records of previous cycles, whether through direct observation, oral tradition, or contact with other surviving groups, and they had carved them into stone specifically so the knowledge would persist beyond any single community's memory. This was an archive, a warning, a manual. Third, the record was unfinished because the final cycle had not ended the way the previous ones had. The carvers had stopped because they could not depict the emergence, because for them, in their time, the emergence had not come. Something about their cycle was different. Something had interrupted the pattern. Or, and this thought arrived more slowly, like water finding a crack, the cycle had completed, and the survivors who emerged simply never returned to finish the record. They came up into sunlight and walked away and built new settlements and had children and forgot, as human beings always forget, as every civilization eventually forgets everything that its predecessor carved into stone to make sure it would be remembered. I looked at the blank upper third of the fourth pillar, and I thought about Göbekli Tepe, 11 kilometers to the west. The famous site. The one that rewrote the textbooks. The enormous carved pillars erected by people who, according to the old models, should not have been capable of monumental construction. The site that was deliberately buried, intentionally, carefully backfilled with rubble by the same people who built it, for reasons no one has ever satisfactorily explained. A site buried at approximately the same depth as the structure I was sitting in approximately the same period, by people with approximately the same technical capability. I did not write this connection in my notebook. I did not photograph it. Some conclusions are too structurally dangerous to create physical evidence of before you have decided what to do with them. But I sat with it. I let it settle into the architecture of my understanding alongside everything else I had seen in the previous hours. And I felt the combined weight of it pressing down on the professional framework I had built my career inside. And I felt that framework deform, but not yet break. Then I heard the sound. It came from the fourth corridor, the one I had not yet entered. The south-leading passage from the central chamber, the one that, if my rough orientation was correct, led back toward the surface, perhaps toward a second entrance or exit that the GPR scans had not resolved. The sound was a scraping, stone on stone, rhythmic, then silence, then rhythmic again. I turned off my headlamp and stood motionless in absolute darkness among the dead. The scraping continued for perhaps 90 seconds. Then it stopped. Then I heard something that was not scraping. It was a vocalization, low, not a word, not language. A sound that a human throat could make, but that no conscious human intention would produce. A tonal, sustained, open-mouthed exhalation, like someone breathing out through a throat that had forgotten how to close. I did not move. I did not breathe. My headlamp was off, and the darkness was total. And the sound was coming from somewhere in the corridor system between me and the central chamber, which meant it was between me and the only exit I knew. The vocalization stopped. Silence returned. Not surface silence, not the silence of wind and insects and distant machinery, but lithic silence.
the silence of stone that has been silent for 8,000 years, interrupted and now resumed. I waited. I counted my breaths, because counting was a thing I could control. At breath 112, I turned my headlamp back on, cupping my hand over it to reduce the beam to a filtered glow through my fingers. I crossed the cavern toward the entrance corridor, moving slowly, placing each foot on stone I had already walked so I knew it would not shift or crumble. The corridor was empty. I moved through it, upslope, toward the central chamber. The central chamber was empty. The 4 corridor mouths gaped darkly in my reduced light, and I stood still and listened, and I heard nothing. The south corridor was directly to my left. I had not entered it. Whatever had made the sound had come from that direction. Between it and me was nothing but open air and stone. I chose not to enter it. I chose to leave. I moved to the entry corridor, the one I had come in through, the one that led up the 47 steps to the opening in the hillside where sunlight and Elif and the 21st century were waiting. I climbed. My legs burned. The air warmed. I saw light, dim, reddish. The light of late afternoon filtering through the excavated aperture. And I climbed faster, abandoning caution, letting my boots scrape and echo. I emerged into a Turkish evening. The pistachio orchards were silver green in the low sun. Elif was sitting on a camp chair near the trench edge, reading from her tablet. James was photographing pottery sherds on a sorting table nearby. The generator hummed. A bird I could not identify was singing in the orchard. Elif looked up and asked me something, and I realized I had been underground for over 4 hours. She had been radioing me. I had not answered. She was concerned, and the concern on her face was the most human thing I had seen since the ceiling panels, and I almost told her everything right then. I did not. I told her the structure was extensive, stable, and significant. I told her I needed to write up preliminary notes before discussing details. I told her we should restrict access until I had completed a full initial survey. She agreed, though I could see she was unsatisfied with the vagueness. James, who had come over during the conversation, gave me a look I had seen before from colleagues who suspected someone was sitting on a major find and hoarding first publication rights. That was not what I was doing, but I did not have the capacity to explain what I was actually doing because I did not yet know. That night, in my tent, I did not sleep. I lay on my cot and I looked at the photographs on my camera's display screen, and I tried to construct a rational alternative to the conclusion I had reached underground. I tried for hours. I applied every framework I had. The carvings were ritual, allegorical, mythological, astronomical, shamanic, funerary, initiatory. I tested each interpretation against the specific details: the branching interior skull stain, the channeled autopsy table, the restrained skeletons, the sequential pillar narrative showing distinct communities experiencing identical catastrophes, the architectural cross-section that matched the building I had stood inside. None of the alternative frameworks held. Each one required me to ignore or reinterpret specific physical evidence that was not ambiguous. The skull stains were not symbolic. The restraints were not ceremonial. The drainage channels on the table were not decorative. These were functional installations, documented by functional images, and the function they served was the identification, containment, and study of a pathogenic transformation that turned living humans into something that retained motility but lost cognition. I was still awake when the pre-dawn call to prayer drifted across the valley from the nearest village. I got up and made coffee on the camp stove, and I sat in the gray light, and I made a decision. I was going back in, and this time I was going to enter the south corridor. I told Elif I needed one more day of solo assessment before we opened the site to the full team. She objected. She was right to object. The protocol was clear, and I was violating it. I told her I suspected the structure might contain human remains that would require sensitive handling under Turkish antiquities law, and that I wanted to confirm before we brought in personnel who might inadvertently compromise the context. This was not entirely a lie. It was not entirely the truth either. She relented, but she told me she was coming in with me the following day, regardless of what I found. I agreed. I descended at 7:15 in the morning. This time I carried more equipment. 2 headlamps, a backup flashlight, additional batteries, 2 liters of water, a protein bar, a handheld GPS unit that would not function underground, but that I brought anyway out of some reflexive need for navigational tools, a folding knife, a 20-meter length of paracord, and a small geological hammer. I also carried a dust mask and nitrile gloves because the skulls had unsettled me in ways I was not fully rationalizing, and because whatever had produced the branching stain inside those crania might conceivably still be present as residue. I went straight to the central chamber. I paused there, listening. The silence was total. No scraping, no vocalization. I shone my headlamp down the south corridor and saw dressed stone walls descending at a moderate angle into darkness. I entered it. The south corridor was wider than the others, nearly 2 meters across, and its walls were uncarved for the first 20 meters. The stone was the same dressed limestone, the same tight joints, but there were no figures, no narrative panels. It felt utilitarian. A transit space, not a display space. The floor was smooth, worn in a shallow concavity along the center line, as if thousands of feet had walked this path enough times to abrade the stone. At 20 meters, the corridor branched, left and right. I tied one end of my paracord to a copper pin embedded in the wall, identical to the ones used to restrain the infected in the cavern, and paid out line as I went left. The left branch ran level for 10 meters, then opened into a room that made me stop in the doorway and reassess everything I thought I understood about the people who built this place. It was a workshop, not a ritual space, not a living area. A workshop. Stone workbenches lined 3 walls, and on them, arranged with the care of surgical instruments, were tools. Flint blades, yes, expected for the period, but also tools I had never seen in a Neolithic context. Thin copper probes, green with patina but structurally intact. Bone needles of extraordinary fineness, curved, with eyes small enough to thread sinew or gut through. Flat stone pallets with residue in shallow depressions, ground pigment in some, but in others a dark residue that looked identical to the branching stain inside the skulls. As if someone had extracted the material and prepared it here. Studied it. Maybe tested it. Along the back wall, a series of stone vessels. Larger than the one I had seen in the niche upstairs, these were perhaps 30 centimeters tall, lidded, sealed with what appeared to be bitumen or pine pitch. I counted 14 of them. They were labeled, not with writing. Writing did not exist yet, but with small carved symbols on each lid. Some showed the branching pattern. Some showed animal figures. Some showed geometric marks I could not interpret. Sealed vessels containing samples, catalogued with a classification system. In a workspace equipped with tools designed for dissection and extraction. These people had built a laboratory. I did not open the vessels. I want to be clear about that. Whatever was inside them had been sealed for 8,000 years or more, and whatever preservative properties the pitch and the limestone environment might have conferred, I was not going to be the person who unsealed them in an uncontrolled environment with no biosafety protocol. I photographed them. I measured them. I noted the symbols. I left them exactly as they were. I backed out of the workshop and returned to the branch point and followed the right fork. The right fork descended steeply. The air changed.
It became damper, cooler, and the organic smell I had noticed on first entry, the spore-like, dried mushroom scent, intensified. The walls here showed moisture. Mineral deposits streaked the stone in white and orange cascades. I was approaching the water table, or a natural spring, or both. After perhaps 15 meters of descent, the corridor opened into another natural cavern, smaller than the one containing the restrained dead. This one had been minimally modified. The floor was unleveled, the walls uncarved, but it contained one critical feature: water. A spring emerged from a fissure in the far wall, ran across the cavern floor in a shallow natural channel, and disappeared into a second fissure at the base of the near wall. Clean, cold, flowing water, deep underground, accessible from within the sealed structure. A permanent, protected water source that no surface contamination could reach. The people who built this place had not merely dug a hole to hide in. They had selected this location because it sat above a reliable aquifer accessed through karst geology. They had engineered their structure to incorporate a natural water source that would sustain an indefinite underground occupation. They had stored seeds. They had stored food. They had created living quarters, research facilities, containment areas, and water access, all connected by a corridor system that could be sealed at multiple points. This was not a shelter. This was a survival installation designed by people who understood that the surface would become uninhabitable for an extended period and who planned accordingly. And they had done this before writing existed, before metallurgy, before the wheel, before agriculture had fully replaced hunting and gathering in the region. They had done it with stone tools and human muscle, and a depth of planning that exceeded most modern emergency preparedness. Because they had to. Because the thing that was coming for them had come before. And someone, somehow, had preserved the knowledge of previous cycles and transmitted it forward to the people who built this place. The pillar carvings were not just records of past outbreaks. They were inherited intelligence. Survival data, passed down through oral tradition or inter-community contact, compiled here in stone as a reference archive for the next time. The next time. The certainty embedded in that phrase settled into me like groundwater into limestone. These people did not build for one emergency. They built for a recurring one. They expected it to happen again. I sat by the spring and drank from my water bottle and listened to the water move in the dark. And I thought about what I was going to do with this. The professional answer was clear. Document everything. Report to the ministry. Publish through proper channels. Invite peer review. Let the evidence speak through the established apparatus of academic validation. That was how it was supposed to work. But I had spent 11 years inside that apparatus, and I knew exactly what would happen. The carvings would be interpreted as mythological. The skulls would be attributed to known pathologies: fungal infection, parasitic calcification, post-mortem mineral intrusion. The restrained skeletons would be framed as evidence of ritual sacrifice or prisoner execution. The laboratory would be described as a ritual preparation space. The sealed vessels would be cataloged and stored, and possibly never opened at all, because opening them would require biosafety protocols that no archaeology department would fund for what they would classify as ceremonial residue. Every piece of evidence I had found would be sanded down by interpretation until it fit inside the existing framework. Not because my colleagues were dishonest, but because the existing framework was the only one they had. The conclusion I had reached, that a zombie-like pathogen had cyclically devastated human populations throughout prehistory, that the people of this region had known it
and prepared for it. That the knowledge had been deliberately preserved in stone was so far outside the boundaries of accepted archaeological interpretation that no amount of physical evidence would overcome the structural resistance to it. I knew this because I would have been one of the people resisting it 3 days ago. But I was not 3 days ago anymore. I was sitting in a Neolithic survival installation, listening to water that had been flowing since the Holocene. And I was thinking not like an archaeologist, but like a man in a building designed to keep people alive when the surface was no longer safe. That shift, from researcher to survivor, happened without my permission. It happened because the building demanded it. Every feature of the structure was oriented toward a single question. How do you sustain human life underground for an indefinite period while the world above you collapses? And once I started seeing the building as an answer to that question rather than as an artifact to be studied, I could not stop. I began evaluating. The water source was reliable, spring-fed, gravity-driven, requiring no mechanical infrastructure. Assuming no upstream contamination, and the depth of the aquifer made surface contamination unlikely, it could sustain a small group indefinitely. The living quarters I had seen could house 6 to 8 people with minimal modification. The stone platforms were structurally sound. The ventilation was passive. I had felt air movement throughout the structure, suggesting natural convection through the limestone, possibly enhanced by the builders through channels I had not yet identified. The workshop contained tools that could be repurposed. The storage niches could hold preserved food. The containment cavern, the one with the 31 restrained skeletons, demonstrated that the builders had solved the problem of safely housing infected individuals for observation, which implied they had also solved the problem of capturing them without being infected themselves. The multiple corridors allowed for compartmentalization. If one section was compromised, it could be sealed off. The evidence of the sealed east chamber proved this was part of the design. The structure was deep enough that surface noise would not penetrate, and surface threats could not access the interior without knowing the entrance location. The south corridor, I realized, must lead to a second entrance. The worn floor, the wider passage, the utilitarian absence of carvings. This was the working entrance. The practical access point, separate from the ceremonial or documentary spaces above. I had not yet followed it to its terminus, but its continued descent toward the spring suggested it might emerge at a lower elevation, perhaps in the creek bed that ran below the mound. A concealed exit, an escape route. I was mapping the survival architecture of an 8,000-year-old bunker, and I was doing it not as an academic exercise, but as contingency planning. Some part of my mind had crossed a threshold that the rest of me had not yet acknowledged, and that part was asking questions that an archaeologist has no reason to ask. Where would I sleep? How would I store food? How long could I stay? How would I seal the entrance if I needed to? I became aware of this shift, and I stopped myself. I sat by the spring, and I pressed my palms against the cool stone floor, and I said, out loud, in the dark, "You are a researcher. You are documenting a site. You are going back to the surface." My voice sounded small and temporary in that space. The water kept flowing. The stone kept its counsel. I followed the south corridor past the branch point, deeper, past the spring cavern. The corridor continued to descend, and after another 30 meters it turned sharply and began to rise. I paid out paracord as I went. The air changed again, warmer now, drier, and I detected a new scent threading through the ambient mineral smell. Organic, but different from the spore-like odor of the upper levels. This was green, vegetative, living. The corridor narrowed. The ceiling dropped. I moved in a crouch for the last 10 meters, and then the stone ended, and I was looking at earth.
packed earth interwoven with pale rootlets, forming a natural plug at the corridor's terminus. Beyond it, filtered through the roots and the soil, came light. Dim, greenish, diffused, but unmistakably daylight. The second entrance, sealed not by stone, but by the slow accumulation of soil and vegetation over millennia, closable from inside by anyone with a few hours and a strong back, and located, I estimated, based on the corridor's trajectory and my rough sense of the terrain above, somewhere on the lower slope of the mound near the creek bed, screened by the pistachio orchard. A hidden exit that a survivor could use to access water, forage, or observe the surface without exposing the main entrance. I did not break through the soil plug. I marked the GPS coordinates of my current position. Useless underground, but useful for surface correlation later. And I turned around and climbed back toward the central chamber. I was halfway up the south corridor, winding my paracord as I went, when I heard the sound again. Not scraping this time. Footsteps. Unmistakable. The flat, arrhythmic slap of bare feet or thin-soled shoes on stone, coming from somewhere above me in the corridor system. Not running, not walking with purpose. Moving the way someone moves when locomotion is not volitional. When the body is in motion, but the mind directing it is absent, or operating on a reduced set of instructions. I killed my headlamp. I pressed my back against the corridor wall. The darkness was absolute. The footsteps continued. They were in the central chamber. I could tell by the slight echo, the change in acoustic character that the larger space produced. They moved across the chamber, paused, moved again, paused. Then the vocalization. The same one I had heard the previous day, that open-throated, uninflected exhalation. Longer this time, sustained for perhaps 5 seconds, then silence, then repeated. It was not communication. It was not distress. It was mechanical. The sound of air moving through a throat whose owner was not choosing to make sound, but whose respiratory process produced it as a byproduct. I stood in the dark and I listened, and I felt the shift that had been building since I first saw the ceiling panels complete itself. I was not going to report this through proper channels. I was not going to wait for peer review. Whatever was making that sound in the central chamber, whether it was a person, an animal, my own auditory system misfiring in the dark, the evidence I had documented over the past 2 days constituted a warning that the established world was not equipped to process in time. The footsteps moved. They entered one of the corridors, not mine, based on the acoustic direction. They receded. The sound faded to silence. I waited. 200 breaths this time. Then I moved, slowly, headlamp off, navigating by memory and by my left hand trailing the wall. I reached the central chamber. I turned on my headlamp. The chamber was empty, but on the floor, in the fine mineral dust that coated the stone, I saw marks, disturbances. Not boot prints. I was wearing boots, and my own prints were clearly visible from previous visits, treaded and regular. These marks were different. They were bare. Human foot-shaped, but the gait pattern was wrong. The spacing was irregular. The weight distribution was skewed, heavier on the balls of the feet, almost no heel strike, as if the walker were perpetually leaning forward, perpetually on the edge of falling and catching itself with the next step. I photographed the prints. I measured the stride length. I noted the direction of travel. From the south corridor, below me, into the east corridor, the one containing the sealed room with the autopsy table. Then I climbed the 47 steps, and I left. What I did next was not professional. It was not measured. It was not what a trained archaeologist with institutional obligations and a reputation to protect should have done. I told Elif that the structure showed signs of imminent geological instability. A lie.
The structure was among the most stable subterranean spaces I had ever entered, and that I was recommending we suspend excavation pending a structural engineering assessment. She was skeptical. She asked to see my documentation. I showed her selected photographs, the corridor, the dressed stone, the central chamber, and withheld the skulls, the carvings, the laboratory, the containment cavern, the spring, the footprints. I told her I would submit a full report within the week. Then I went to Schonlierfe and I bought supplies. Not archaeological supplies, survival supplies.
Canned food, water purification tablets, a medical kit, batteries, a solar charging panel, 2 emergency blankets, a camp stove with fuel canisters, and a hand crank radio. I told myself these were precautionary. I told myself I was being thorough. I did not believe myself. Over the following 6 days, working alone during hours when the rest of the team was occupied at other sites or in the lab processing material from KT-7 and KT-8, I made 4 more descents into KT-9. I completed a systematic photographic survey of every carved surface. I mapped the corridor system with compass bearings and paced distances, and produced a plan drawing that I kept in a separate notebook from my official field records. I inventoried the sealed vessels in the laboratory without opening them. I confirmed the second entrance from the surface by locating the corresponding depression in the creek bank, screened by oleander and wild fig, invisible unless you knew to look. And I cached my supplies. I did this with the same methodical care I applied to excavation. I selected the spring cavern as the primary storage location, cool, dry enough above the waterline, and accessible from both entrances. I placed the food and equipment in nitrile-wrapped bundles on stone ledges above the floodline. I tested the solar panel at the second entrance, where filtered light reached the soil plug, and confirmed it could charge devices if the plug were partially opened. I ran my hand crank radio and picked up Turkish stations clearly through the natural limestone ventilation channels. I was preparing a survival installation inside an 8,000-year-old survival installation, and the only thing that prevented me from recognizing the full absurdity of this was the evidence on the walls around me. Evidence that someone had done exactly the same thing for exactly the same reason, and that their preparation had kept people alive through a catastrophe that my own civilization did not believe was possible. On my final descent, day 9, I went back to the containment cavern. I wanted to examine the restrained skeletons more carefully, particularly the branching cranial stains. James Okoro was the physical anthropologist, not me, and I wanted to record details that a specialist might later find diagnostic. I was crouched in front of the 14th skeleton, photographing the interior of the left orbit with a macro lens, when I noticed something I had missed on every previous visit. The copper pin securing the skeleton's wrist restraints to the wall was different from the others. The others were driven flush with the stone surface. This one protruded slightly, perhaps 2 centimeters, and its head was not corroded to the same degree. The patina was lighter. The metal beneath was brighter. It was newer. Not modern, but newer than the others by what I estimated, based on patination rates in similar environments, could be centuries, maybe a millennium, maybe more recently than that. I looked at the skeleton more carefully. The calcification encasing the bones was thinner than on the adjacent remains. The preservation of the braided restraints was slightly better. The bone itself was marginally less mineralized. This individual had been placed here later than the others. Significantly later. Someone had returned to this cavern, long after the original builders had sealed it and left, and had restrained an infected person in the same manner, in the same row, using the same technique, continuing the practice, maintaining the protocol. Because the infection had returned, as the pillars predicted it would. And someone, a descendant of the original builders, a member of a later community that had preserved or rediscovered the knowledge, had come back to this place and used it for its intended purpose. I checked the remaining skeletons in the row with new attention. 3 more showed the same signs of later placement: lighter patination on the pins, thinner calcification, marginally better bone preservation. 4 individuals, added to the original 27 at some later date. The installation had been reused. The cycle had repeated, and people had come back here, and they had done what the walls told them to do. The archive had worked. The warning had been received, at least once, by someone who understood it and acted on it. This should have been reassuring. It was not. Because it meant the cycle was real. It was not a single prehistoric event that I could file under ancient catastrophe and contain within the past. It was a pattern that had repeated at least once after the original construction, which meant the mechanism that produced it, whatever biological or environmental trigger initiated the infection, was not extinct. It was dormant, periodic, patient. And if it had happened twice, the only question was when it would happen again. I ascended for the last time. I sealed my notebooks. I encrypted my photographs on 2 separate drives. I told Elif I was returning to Chicago to consult with the university on the engineering assessment. She told me she thought I was behaving strangely. She was right. I flew home. I spent 3 weeks in my apartment analyzing photographs and refining my documentation. I drafted a paper that I knew I would never submit to a journal. I contacted 2 colleagues, a paleopathologist at Johns Hopkins and a microbiologist at ETH Zurich, with carefully worded inquiries about known prehistoric pathogens capable of producing the kind of cranial staining I had documented. The paleopathologist suggested fungal infection, possibly an ancient Ophiocordyceps relative. The microbiologist asked to see the photographs and then went quiet for 4 days before emailing me a single line. "Where exactly is this site?" I did not answer her. I monitored the news. I monitored disease surveillance databases. I monitored forums where preppers and epidemiologists and fringe theorists all tracked unusual illness clusters with varying degrees of rigor and credibility. I did not know what I was looking for, but I was looking. And then, 14 months after I left Turkey, I found it. A report from the WHO's weekly epidemiological record, buried in a regional summary for Southeast Asia. An unusual cluster of encephalitis cases in a rural district of Myanmar. 47 cases over 3 weeks. Symptoms included acute behavioral changes, loss of speech, persistent ambulatory movement, and, the detail that stopped my breathing, involuntary jaw depression. Patients' mouths hung open. Their eyes were described as non-reactive and vacant. They did not respond to verbal stimuli. They moved in groups. They were aggressive toward the uninfected. The report classified it as a probable novel arboviral encephalitis. An investigation was ongoing. No follow-up report was ever published. I searched for additional information. Local news sources, in Burmese, described the affected village as having been quarantined by the military. Satellite imagery showed vehicle activity consistent with a cordon. Then, 3 weeks after the initial report, the village no longer appeared in any news source at all. The quarantine was not lifted. It was simply never mentioned again. I pulled up my photographs from KT9. I looked at the second pillar, the one depicting a coastal community's outbreak. I looked at the wave motifs along its base. I looked at the seasonal star markers. I looked at the sequence: animal contact, single transformation, mass transformation, barrier, retreat,
Siege, clearance, emergence. I looked at the third panel on the ceiling, the single transformed figure lying prone, surrounded by three others, one of whom had already turned. I looked at the WHO report again. 47 cases, 3 weeks. A village that disappeared from the record. The pattern was the same. The timeline was the same. The symptoms were the same. I booked a flight to Shanlurfa that night. I was not going back to study the site. I was going back to make sure my supplies were still cached. I was going back to confirm the second entrance was still passable. I was going back to check the water flow and the ventilation and the sealability of the corridors. I was going back because the people who carved those pillars 8,000 years ago had built the only structure on Earth that was explicitly designed to survive what I believed was beginning to happen again. And they had left its instruction manual on the walls for whoever came next. I arrived at the site on a Tuesday evening. The camp was reduced. The survey season had ended, and only a local guard remained, a cousin of the farmer Mehmet, who slept in a trailer near the road and checked the trenches twice a day. I told him I was conducting a follow-up survey. He was not interested enough to question this. I descended at dawn. The structure was unchanged. The air was the same. The water still flowed. My cached supplies were undisturbed, but the footprints in the central chamber were different. There were more of them. The same barefoot, forward-weighted, irregular gait pattern, but denser now, overlapping, circulating through the central chamber and into the east and west corridors and back. Dozens of passes, hundreds. And on the floor of the containment cavern, near the row of restrained skeletons, a new mark. A disturbance in the mineral dust. Something had been dragged. The drag marks led from the cavern entrance to the far wall, to the empty space at the end of the row of dead. The 32nd position. The space where no skeleton sat. The copper pin was already in the wall. I had not noticed it before. It was flush with the stone, indistinguishable from the ones anchoring the ancient dead. But now I saw that its surface was bright. No patina at all. Fresh copper, driven into limestone, positioned at exactly the right height to secure the wrist restraints of a seated figure. Someone had prepared the 32nd position. Recently. Within weeks, maybe days, and the drag marks suggested that something, or someone, had been brought to it, but not yet secured. The marks ended at the wall, but there was no body there, no restraints deployed. Whatever had been dragged had been brought to the position and then had moved, or been moved, away. I stood in that cavern, and I looked at the empty 32nd position, and I understood that I was not the only person who had found this place. Someone else had been here. Someone who understood the containment protocol well enough to install a new pin and drag an infected individual to the wall. Someone who was operating the installation for its intended purpose. Right now. In this cycle. The sound came again. Not from the corridors this time. From the cavern itself. From behind the row of the ancient dead. A vocalization. Low. Sustained. And then, underneath it, another sound. A different one. A sound I had not heard before in this place. Breathing. Normal breathing. Controlled, quiet, human breathing. The breathing of someone who is awake and alert and deliberately silent, exhaling through their nose in slow, measured intervals. Two presences, one making the sound of the infected, one making the sound of a person trying not to be heard. I turned my headlamp toward the far end of the cavern. The beam swept across the restrained skeletons, across the empty 32nd position, across the rough stone wall beyond. In the shadows past the last skeleton, pressed flat against the wall, a man looked back at me. He was alive. He was human. His eyes tracked my light with full cognitive awareness. He was perhaps 60 years old, lean, wearing clothes that were worn but not ragged. A canvas jacket, work trousers, boots caked with mud consistent with the creek bed outside. In his right hand, he held a length of braided cord, the same material as the ancient restraints, handmade, freshly braided. At his feet, on the ground, curled on its side, was a second figure. This one was not looking at me. This one was not looking at anything. Its eyes were open and empty, and its jaw hung slack, and it was making the vocalization. That low, uninflected mechanical exhalation, and it was moving. Not purposefully, not toward me, just moving. Its hands opened and closed. Its legs shifted. Its head turned slowly, continuously, like a satellite dish scanning for a signal it could no longer find. The old man did not speak. He looked at me. He looked at the braided cord in his hand. He looked at the copper pin in the 32nd position. And I understood. He was not a researcher. He was not an archaeologist. He was the current operator of this facility. He was doing what the builders had done, what the later users had done, what the pillar carvings documented across multiple cycles of civilization and collapse. He was catching the infected. He was bringing them underground. He was restraining them. He was studying them. He was maintaining the protocol. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the infected figure at his feet. Then he held out the braided cord toward me. Not threatening, not pleading, offering. He needed help securing the 32nd occupant. And in that gesture, that silent, practical, 8,000-year-old gesture, I understood that the cycle was not beginning again. It had never stopped. The ruins were not ancient. They were active. They had always been active. The infection was not an event that happened and ended and happened again. It was a constant. A low, persistent background hum of the human biological landscape, managed in places like this by people like this man, kept below the threshold of visibility by a containment practice so old that it predated every civilization that had ever claimed to understand the world. The WHO report from Myanmar was not the beginning of a new outbreak. It was a local failure of containment. A place where the practice had lapsed, or the practitioner had died, or the installation had been destroyed by development or conflict or neglect. And the infection had breached the surface long enough to be noticed before someone, another operator, another inheritor of the protocol, sealed it again. The man was still holding out the cord. I took it. I knelt beside the figure on the ground. Its hand closed around my wrist, not with predatory intent, not with the lunge of a movie zombie, but with the aimless grip of a body whose nervous system was firing without direction. The fingers were cold. The skin was dry. The eyes looked through me at nothing. The man showed me how to loop the cord, how to pin the wrist, how to secure the jaw with a separate binding so the vocalization would stop and the teeth could not make contact. His movements were practiced, economical. He had done this before. When the 32nd occupant was secured, seated, pinned, bound, silent, the man finally spoke. His language was not Turkish. It was not Arabic. It was not Kurdish. I did not recognize it. But he said one word while pointing at the ceiling, at the unfinished fourth pillar visible through the cavern entrance, at the blank space where the final cycle's conclusion had never been carved. He said the word, and then he picked up a stone chisel from a ledge I had not noticed, and he walked to the pillar, and he began to carve. I stayed. I am still here. The supplies I cached are sustaining me while he teaches me what the walls say. Not through language we share, because we do not share one, but through the carvings themselves, through demonstration, through the daily practice of monitoring the south corridor entrance where the infected occasionally wander in from the creek bed, drawn by whatever residual signal the installation emits or the pathogen detects.
He is finishing the fourth pillar. The story he is carving is not the ancient one. It is the current one. Ours. The cycle that includes the Myanmar cluster and the village that disappeared, and the 47 cases that were never followed up on. And below his carvings, in the space that remains, I have begun to carve my own. Not the branching pathogen, not the restrained dead. I am carving a map, a schematic of the installation, its corridors, its water source, its containment protocol, its tool inventory, rendered in the same visual grammar the original builders used, so that whoever comes next will not need to reverse engineer the system the way I did. They will find the manual already complete. Because the fourth pillar will be finished soon, and when it is, someone will need to start the fifth. The cycle does not end. It is not supposed to end. The infection is part of the human biological substrate, as persistent as malaria, as ancient as the species, managed not by cure, but by containment, not by civilization, but by a practice older than civilization, maintained in hidden places by people whose names are never recorded and whose work is never seen. I was an archaeologist. I studied the past because I believed it was past. I was wrong. The past is underneath us. It is operational. And it is full.